Montana Territory. Spring of 1881. The wind screamed across the empty plains outside of Dry Willow when the town buried its last bit of hope under a name they spat like poison. Cursed. Georgia Rylan stood alone at the edge of the cemetery, her black skirts heavy with dust, the townsfolk already halfway down the hill, not one of them offering a glance back. Her hands trembled around the two small palms clinging to her dress, her son, Caleb, and her daughter, Katie, standing barefoot in the dirt beside her. Not one soul in Dry Willow had come to see her husband lowered into the ground, not after what happened the last time she dared to hope for kindness. She whispered a prayer for the man they buried, though he had never loved her properly, and then for the children, though they were not his by blood. And then she turned, taking her children's hands in hers, and walked down into the wind without looking back. They said she brought death. That every man who got close to her met the grave. That she smiled and sickness bloomed. That her eyes held storms. She had buried 2 husbands and 1 stillborn child, and that was enough for this town to curse her name. Weeks passed. She made her living mending clothes and tending to the sick who had nowhere else to go. Her small cabin, 2 miles from town, stood alone near the creek, half built by her second husband before the fever took him. She did not ask for help. She did not visit the town more than she had to. But she kept her back straight and her chin high. That was when the cowboy rode into Dry Willow. He came in quiet, long in the saddle, with dust on his shoulders and a rifle strapped across his back. Nobody knew his name, only that he watered his horse and paid in gold for a room above the livery. He did not drink, did not gamble, and did not talk unless spoken to. But Georgia saw him. She was in the mercantile with Caleb and Katie, bartering for flour with the last of her coin when the door opened and he stepped in. The way the light broke around him made her freeze. He was tall, lean, with a steady face and eyes that looked like they had seen too much. His shirt was sun-bleached and his boots were cracked, but he moved like a man who knew how to survive anything. Their eyes met. He nodded once. She nodded back. He walked past her and never glanced again. "Who is he?" Caleb whispered, tugging at her apron. "I do not know," she said, "and we do not need to." But 2 days later the trouble started. A rancher's boy went missing near the southern ridge, and the town blamed it on Georgia. Said she had cursed the child just by looking at him the week before. Said her bad luck had reached out again. A group of men rode out in anger, shouting her name, rifles in hand and hate in their mouths. Caleb saw them first. He ran from the tree line, yelling for her and Katie to hide. Georgia grabbed her children and rushed into the root cellar behind the house. Her heart beat against her ribs so hard it hurt. Outside, the riders dismounted. They kicked open her door, tore through her cabin, shouted her name. One of them, Jackson Holt, lit a torch and threw it at the porch. Georgia held Katie's mouth shut as the fire caught. Then came the sound of hooves. Fast, hard, 1 horse. A voice cut through the shouting. "Put it out." She could not see, but she knew it was him, the cowboy from town. "I said put it out," he growled again. The riders hesitated. "What is this to you, stranger?" Jackson spat. "I saw the boy," the cowboy said. 5 miles south, found him myself. Got lost in the gulch. He is fine, just cold. I brought him back." Jackson cursed. She hexed him. "You do not know what she is. I know you were about to burn a woman alive with her children inside," the cowboy snapped. "You want to play brave? Try me." Silence. Then boots shuffled. Saddles creaked. The men left. Georgia did not move until the cellar door opened. He stood there, the firelight behind him fading. She saw his face clearly now, lines carved deep, jaw tight, eyes still burning from what he had just done. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, unable to speak. He looked down at Caleb and Katie, holding her hands like they were the last good things in the world. Then he looked back at her. "Name's Landon Zeke," he said. "I do not believe in curses." The next day, he returned with hammer and nails. Said nothing, just started fixing what the fire had taken. She offered him water. That was all. He drank it and kept working. By the 5th day, the porch stood sturdy again. He fixed the door, too, and the broken window, and even mended the roof where the smoke had curled. Caleb followed him around like a shadow. Katie smiled more than she had in months. Georgia kept watching him from the kitchen window. The way he crouched to talk to Caleb. The way he patted the dog on the head every evening. The way he lingered near the edge of the house at dusk, always looking west like he was waiting for something. That night, she stepped onto the porch. "You ride out tomorrow?" she asked. He nodded slowly. That was the plan. She crossed her arms. "Thank you for saving my children." He looked at her. "You saved them, I just showed up." She looked away, but not fast enough to hide the crack in her voice. "They think I am cursed. They are wrong," she laughed, shaky. "You do not know me." "I know enough," he said. Silence stretched between them. Then he added, "You do not scare me, Georgia." Her name in his mouth did something strange to her chest. She cleared her throat. "You can stay. If you want work, there is always something that needs fixing." He stared at her for a long time. "All right," he said, and just like that he stayed. Landon stayed in the loft above the livery but spent most days out near the creek, repairing the fence that edged Georgia's land. He didn't ask for pay. Georgia didn't offer it. There was a rhythm to it, quiet, steady, and they both moved inside it like they understood the same unspoken things. By June, the cottonwoods had leafed out thick along the banks, and the creek ran lower but clearer. Katie took to bringing him wildflowers, and Caleb followed him with questions about horses and rifles and places he'd been. Georgia watched from the cabin, sewing or stirring the pot on the stove, her hands always working but her eyes often drifting. One evening, after the sun had dipped behind the hills and the crickets had started up, Landon lingered near the porch steps, brushing dirt from his palms. "You ever think about leaving Dry Willow?" he asked, his voice low. Georgia didn't look up from the shirt she was mending. "I've thought about it plenty." He waited, but she didn't say more. She tied off the thread, bit it clean, and glanced at him. "But leaving means someone else gets the house. And the land. It's the only thing left that's mine." He nodded. "I understand." Katie came out carrying a battered tin cup of water, offered it to him with both hands. He crouched to take it, his fingers gentle as he thanked her. She beamed, then skipped off to chase fireflies. Georgia set her mending aside. "You have kin?" she asked. "Not anymore." She didn't press him. He didn't offer more. The next day she found him chopping wood behind the cabin. She came out carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "You'll need a proper shirt if you're going to swing that axe all summer." He paused, wiped sweat from his brow, and opened the bundle. Inside was a faded red cotton shirt neatly stitched, sleeves long enough for his arms. "Made it from one of Elijah's," she said. "He was near your size." He didn't ask which husband Elijah had been. He just nodded once, then folded the shirt with care. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. A nightmare, thick with heat and smoke. Georgia sat with him until his breathing slowed. When she stepped outside, the moon was high, and Landon sat near the edge of the porch, whittling something in his hands. She sat beside him, not speaking. He passed her the carving. A small wooden horse, rough but sturdy. "For Caleb," he said. She turned it over in her hands. "He'll love it." The silence between them stretched again, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt full, like a river waiting to rise. After a while, she said, "You plan on staying through harvest, if you'll have me." She looked at him, really looked. "I think we've both lived long enough with people deciding when we're welcome." He didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened. They sat like that until the moon dipped low and the air turned cold. When she rose, he rose too and walked her to the door without saying a word. And inside, as she tucked Caleb in, she saw the carved horse still in his hand, held tight even in sleep. The next morning, Landon brought a coil of rope and a quiet proposition. "I saw a mare down by the ridge," he said. "Looks loose. Might have slipped a brand. If I can catch her, she'd be a good one for Caleb." Georgia set down the kettle. "You think she'll let you close?" "I've got a way with ones that spook easy." She studied him. "Then maybe she'll trust you." He touched his hat, and she noticed his hands scarred, strong, careful. He left before the sun crested. Didn't come back until dusk, leading a dun-colored mare with a white blaze and a steady gait. Caleb ran to the fence, wide-eyed. "She's yours," Landon said. "If your ma agrees." Georgia crossed her arms, lips pressed, but her eyes gave her away. "I'll teach him," Landon said. "Step by step, gentle." She gave one small nod. "All right." That night, Caleb named her Daisy, and Georgia, watching her son's joy, felt something shift, something long buried, something like hope, beginning to stretch its limbs. Later, when the children were asleep and she stepped outside to find Landon still brushing the horse down by lantern light, she walked over and stood beside him. "She'll need a saddle." "I'll build one." She glanced sideways. "You always this sure about things?" "Not always," he said. "But I know what's worth the work." She said nothing, but her hand brushed his when she reached for the lantern. Neither of them moved away. The creek murmured behind them, the wind soft through the grass. And in that quiet, something unspoken settled between them, strong, steady, and just beginning. The wheatgrass had grown tall along the southern edge of the property, pale green and whispering in the breeze. Georgia watched Landon from the kitchen, his shoulders moving slow, and even as he dug a new post hole with Caleb beside him, measuring the line where the fence would stretch. She kneaded dough at the counter, the heel of her hand softening into rhythm with the boys' laughter threading through the open window. In late July, the rains came late and brief. The cabin roof held. The creek thinned but didn't dry out. Landon had started sleeping on a cot in the shed, though he never said why he gave up the room in town. She didn't ask. He built a smokehouse behind the cabin, showed Caleb how to salt meat, taught Katie to braid a rope from creek reeds. He didn't speak much about himself, but his hands never lied. They were the kind that had done hard things, but now moved with care. One afternoon, Georgia was up the ridge with Katie looking for chokecherries when she spotted Landon below, talking with two men on horseback. She crouched low, pulling Katie against her. The men were strangers, one with a coat too fine for the territory, the other scarred across the temple. Landon stood easy but alert, his hand never far from the butt of the revolver at his side. That night, as she shelled beans on the porch, she didn't wait for him to bring it up. "You knew them?" "No," he said, crouching to check the lantern wick. "But they knew me." She set the bowl aside. "They mean trouble," he thumbed the flint. "They might. Depends how long they hold a grudge." She didn't blink. "What kind?" "Years back, I worked for a man moving freight through Apache territory. Didn't know he was running rifles till it was too late. I left. Took the loss. Not everyone else did." She leaned back against the porch rail, fingers laced loosely in her lap. "You think they'll come back?" "Maybe." She nodded once. "Then we'll be ready." He looked at her then, really looked like he'd stepped into a place he hadn't known he needed. She didn't drop her gaze. The days lengthened. Georgia sent Caleb to help the neighbor's boy bring in hay while she and Katie tended to the smokehouse. Landon spent the midday hours cutting timber for winter. In the evenings, he carved things: birds, a fox, a tiny cradle for Katie's rag doll, and left them on the windowsill without a word. She knew each one had taken time, and that time meant something. One evening, as they shelled corn together near the fire, she asked without ceremony, "What did you lose?" He didn't look up. "A brother, younger. Took a bullet meant for me. I was 17. She reached for another ear. "Mine was named Joseph. Drowned in the river when I was 12. Never saw it coming. The fire popped. He passed her a fresh cob. "Don't leave, does it?" she said. He shook his head once. "It just gets quieter." The next morning, before dawn, Georgia woke to the dog barking sharp and low. She pulled her shawl close and stepped onto the porch. Landon already stood there, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the edge of the trees. He didn't speak until the barking stopped. Just one rider, passed through, didn't stop. She wrapped her arms tighter. "You think it'll be them?" "Not yet." "But close." She watched him scan the horizon like the land spoke to him. "You still thinking of leaving?" she asked. "I was before." "And now," he turned toward her, "now I'm thinking about what stays." She didn't reply. Just nodded once and stepped back inside, letting the door fall shut behind her. That week, Caleb came down with fever. It hit fast, left him soaked and shaking by sundown. Georgia sat at his side through the night, sponge and basin close. Katie curled up on the floor nearby. Landon didn't leave the cabin. He brewed willow bark and read aloud from the one book Caleb kept under his cot, his voice low and steady. By the third day, the fever broke. Georgia stood outside leaning against the post, arms limp from worry. Landon brought her coffee, handed it to her without a word, and stood beside her till the mug cooled in her hands. She didn't thank him. He didn't need her to. That night, she found him outside under the cottonwoods, sharpening his knife by lantern light. "I can't keep waiting for them to show," she said. "If they're coming, I want to see them." He looked up without pausing. "I know a place. High ridge, good sight line. We can ride at first light." She nodded. "I'll leave Katie with Mrs. Lowry." Caleb's strong enough to stay a few hours. He stood and wiped the blade clean. "You ever shoot?" "Only once. Missed a coyote by 10 feet. I'll teach you." She didn't smile. "I'll learn." The wind moved through the trees just then, and he stepped closer, not quite touching but near enough she could feel the heat of him. "I don't want to bring trouble to your door," he said. "You didn't," she answered. "It was already here. You just stood in front of it." He exhaled slow, like he'd been holding breath for years. She reached for his hand, not fast, not shy. He met her halfway. They stood like that, fingers tangled, the lantern flickering low, the last of the summer heat lifting off the earth like something finally letting go. The ridge rose slow and steady, pale grass brushing their stirrups as Landon led them up the narrow trail. The morning was cool, the sky thin with high clouds, and Georgia's borrowed rifle rested across her lap. She rode with her shoulders stiff, her eyes scanning the breaks in the trees the way he'd taught her. The mare beneath her was calm, sure-footed, and she kept her heels light. When they reached the outcrop, they dismounted without a word. Landon tied the horses in the shade of a stunted pine and unrolled a blanket across the stone shelf. From here, the land unfurled wide and clear cottonwoods lining the creek far below, the faint thread of dry willow road cutting west, and beyond that, the hills that leaned toward Wyoming. He crouched, lifted the spyglass from his saddlebag and passed it to her. "Look just east of that split cottonwood." She adjusted the focus. "2 riders, same coats as before. They've been circling since yesterday. You think they'll come close? They're measuring how far I'll follow." She lowered the glass. "And will you?" He leaned back on his hands, squinting into the light. "Not until they touch anything that's mine." She didn't answer. Instead, she set the rifle beside her and pulled a cloth bundle from her skirt pocket. Inside were 2 slices of cornbread wrapped in waxed paper. She handed him one and took the other. He took a bite, chewing slow. "You ever think about marrying again?" She didn't flinch. "Not until lately." He nodded once. She brushed crumbs from her lap. It's not that I didn't want to love again. I just didn't believe I could be trusted with it. You can, he said. Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from how plainly he said it. She turned her face toward the wind. You said you knew what was worth the work. I did. And now I know what's worth staying for. She met his eyes, and something between them settled deeper. Not a spark, something heavier than that, something meant to last. They stayed on the ridge until the sun climbed high, the riders below turning back toward the hills. When they returned to the cabin, Georgia found Katie sitting cross-legged on the floor with Mrs. Lowry's knitting needles in hand, her tongue between her teeth in concentration. Caleb was outside, stacking kindling near the shed. Later that night, Georgia stepped into the shed while Landon was oiling his saddle. The lantern cast a low glow, catching the worn edges of leather and the curve of his jaw. I've decided, she said. He didn't look up. About what? About you, he waited. I want you to stay, not just through the season, not just till they're gone. I want you here with us for good. He rested his hands on the saddle horn. I've never had a home that wasn't borrowed. This one isn't borrowed, it's mine. And I'm offering part of it to you. He stood, the quiet between them thick with meaning. You sure? He asked. I've never been more. He stepped forward slowly until he was close enough to touch her, but he didn't, not yet. You and the children, you're all I've wanted without knowing how to ask. She reached up, touching the edge of his collar. You don't have to ask, just say yes. I do. And this time she didn't hesitate when she leaned in. Their lips met, warm, unhurried, sure. It was not a kiss of urgency, but of promise. One that spoke of winter mornings and summer chores and the long, quiet years ahead. It was a beginning that felt like it had waited a lifetime. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his chest. What about the men? She asked. They'll ride through, and if they don't, I'll meet them far from this door. You're not alone anymore. No, he said. I'm not. That night he didn't return to the shed. He stayed in the cabin on the floor beside Caleb's cot, Katie curled nearby with her doll tucked under her chin. Georgia watched him sleep for a long while, the lines on his face softened by rest. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the stars hung steady above the roof he helped rebuild. Inside, the curse the town had clung to so tightly had lifted, not with fire or force, but with time and care, and a love strong enough to stay. Georgia tied her apron behind her back, the morning sun already warming the floorboards beneath her bare feet. Outside, the hens scratched under the lilac bush, and from the creek came the sound of Katie's laughter, high and clear. She could see Caleb crouched near the water's edge, showing her how to balance stones. A little farther off, Landon was driving the last fence stake into place, his shirt damp at the collar, his hair pushed back from his brow. She turned back to the dough rising in the bowl on the table. The rhythm of the house had shifted in subtle ways, more boots by the door, an extra cup set out without thinking, the sound of a man's voice in the evening, low and steady. It had become a shared life, not through declarations, but through the daily work of it, and it suited her. By the time the loaves were cooling on the sill, Landon was back, cleaning his hands at the pump. He stepped inside, pausing near the doorframe, eyes sweeping the room as if taking inventory of the life he'd stepped fully into. Ryder and Holt rode out this morning, he said, voice even. The stable hand saw them head west, no camp, no talk, just gone. She wiped her hands on a cloth and leaned against the counter. They won't be back. If they're smart, they won't. She nodded once, then crossed to pour him coffee. He took it from her hands without looking away. It hadn't taken long for her to read the quiet in him, not silence, but pause. Not distance, but wait. She'd grown used to it now, and he to her ways, to the way she kept her sorrow folded small, the way she held her children like she'd never let go again. As he drank, she said, "I've been thinking about the land just past the lower field." He raised a brow. "It's good soil. We could put in beans, maybe winter squash, build out the cellar before the cold comes." He set the cup down gently. Her mouth curved, slow and sure. "You're not just fixing fences anymore." He reached for her then, but she didn't let him lead. She stepped into him, arms sliding beneath his, her cheek resting against his shoulder. He held her like he meant to keep her there, and she let herself be held. Later that week, the preacher came in from Miles City. Georgia asked him to stop by without ceremony, without crowd. She wore a dress the color of dry prairie grass, and Katie carried wildflowers in her fists. Caleb stood beside Landon, chin lifted, looking every bit the young man he was becoming. They said their vows under the cottonwood, the one that leaned east, its limbs gnarled but strong. There were no rings, only hands joined and words spoken plain and true. When the preacher tipped his hat and rode off, Georgia turned toward the cabin, their cabin now, and Landon followed with his hand at the small of her back. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, they lay side by side with the window open, the breeze carrying in the distant sound of frogs. Her head rested against his chest, and his hand traced the curve of her spine. "You ever wonder if we'd have met somewhere else?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "Wouldn't have been the same. We both had to get here first." She breathed in slow, feeling the shape of his words settle deep. "I don't dream of running anymore," she said. "Not even when it's quiet." "Me neither," he said. "I used to ride hard just to keep ahead of the weight. Now I ride to be home before dark." She smiled against his skin. "You are home." Fall came early that year. The air turned crisp, and the leaves along the creek blushed gold. Georgia stitched wool blankets for the beds, and Landon built a smoke flap for the chimney. They harvested squash and strung onions to dry, and Caleb learned to trap rabbits with snares Landon showed him how to tie. Katie took to following Georgia through the garden rows, dropping seeds in the furrows with careful fingers. One morning, Georgia found Landon in the corner room, hammering nails into a cedar cradle he'd carved. He didn't say anything when she stepped inside, but she saw the soft pride in his face, the way his hands moved with certainty. She stepped close, rested her hand lightly over his, and he turned toward her, eyes steady. She nodded, her smile quiet and full. "Yes." He lifted her hand to his lips. They did not speak of what had come before, not of the men buried or the names whispered in town. That life had been endured. This one was being built. With each brick, each meal, each nightfall shared in warmth and peace, they rewrote their place in the world. By winter, the cradle stood near the hearth, and the cabin was full of the scent of pine and bread and something finer still belonging. Landon sat in the rocker most evenings with Katie curled at his feet and Caleb reading aloud. Georgia stitched by lantern light, her belly rounding beneath her apron, her heart steady. On the first snow of December, they stood in the doorway together, watching the flakes fall thick and slow. "Never thought I'd call a place mine," Landon said softly. She leaned into his side. "It wasn't the land. It was the people." He kissed the top of her head. They turned back inside where the fire waited and the cradle sat ready. The world outside was vast and wild, but in that cabin beneath the cottonwoods there was peace, hard-earned and lasting. And this time it stayed.